Imperial Yeast is at it again with their Imperialis project, creating yet another unique proprietary strain through hybridization. In addition to its excellent attenuation and rapid reduction of diacetyl, I-10 Mangostini contributes robust ripe tropical fruit, strawberry, and lychee notes that complement modern hops. And as a Kveik hybrid, it can be fermented anywhere from 78 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 to 32 degrees Celsius without any negative issues. Head over to imperialyeast.com to learn more about I-10 Mangostini and be sure to pick some up for your next batch of fruity IPA. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Bitterness is one of the 5 basic tastes and offers a pleasing counterpoint to the sweetness of alcohol and sugar in beer. And along with its antimicrobial properties, it's easy to see why brewers started using hops. And as most brewers, especially lager brewers, know, hitting that perfect balance of bitter and sweet can be quite challenging. I'm your host, Cade Job, and today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we apply the science from last week's episode, What Happens to Hop Bitter Acids During the Boil, with Maria Barreto Carvajal Pinto.
I like how you set that up as a context of balance, because I think that we've gotten to the point where we no longer want super bitter beers for the most part. But, even a light lager with just a few IBUs, without those, it would just be utterly sweet. And then you have things on the, obviously the other end of the spectrum, like a big imperial stout, which is really sweet and malt forward. And so it's kind of a stylistic thing, but it's really important lever that we can pull to achieve the balance that we're looking for in any given direction.
Absolutely, that's true. I don't know. I don't know that we're totally away from those insanely bitter beers. I mean, there's certainly a trend back towards that West Coast IPA right now, or at least what I'm seeing. Are you seeing that too, where beers are getting a little bit more bitter? We're no longer in that like just totally hazy, sweet, tropical, non-bitter. We're kind of moving back.
I think that we're learning lessons from the East and applying them out West, right? In that the IBUs in West Coast IPAs are going down. And, I remember in the 10 years ago or something, the IBU wars where 100 plus IBUs were the norm for IPAs. And now, a really well-crafted West Coast IPA could be 50 or 60. And that, of course, measured IBUs are a whole nother thing. But a lot of the IBUs are also coming from a Whirlpool edition in a West Coast IPA. So even though it might register as 60, it might be... There's a big difference between the perception of 60 IBUs all at 60 minutes versus, 20 at 60 and then the remaining 40 at Whirlpool. So even though we might have a similar number of IBUs in a given product, we're modulating when we add them and lowering that perception of bitterness down.
Absolutely. And then needless to say, there's a lot that occurs during the boil. I mean, there's, like you mentioned, isomerization of alpha acids into isoacids, which happens at that 60-minute addition. But there's evaporation, there's concentrating sugars and bitterness. There, as we know now, are hop and protein interactions that change how much of those bitter acids make it into the final wort and beer. And of course, Maria's research offered us a novel look at those protein-hop interactions, which we'll talk about today. And of course, Jordan and I are going to also apply the science to our brewing practices and look at what kind of considerations we make to hit our target bitterness. Like Jordan was just saying, are we hitting a 60-minute edition, a 30-minute, a 20-minute, a Whirlpool? How do we manage all of these things and hit that target balanced bitterness? But first, if you're not already a patron of Brülosophy, please consider becoming one. We really appreciate the support we get from our patrons, and as a reward, you get access to unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. Becoming a patron is easy. There's no obligation. You can cancel at any time, but if you're out there listening to this show, I really hope you'll check it out and perhaps make it a New Year's resolution to start contributing and taking advantage of those awesome rewards. And of course, we're starting out the new year with a bang, hosting Brad Ring, president and editor of Brew Your Own magazine, to answer Patreon questions in January. If you're a home brewer or a commercial brewer and you haven't subscribed to Brew Your Own, it's really, really good content. You need to check it out. And everything Brad puts out has been good so far. At least in my opinion. He's a great wealth of knowledge, and I'm pretty sure you can ask him anything you want to about homebrewing. So everything you need to know to become a patron is listed at patreon.com/Brülosophy, so please go check it out. And another great way to support us is by using those links at brülosophy.com/support. There are some really cool affiliates who give us just a small kickback if you purchase from their site by using one of our links. And it doesn't change any part of your shopping experience, but it does help us out. So head over to brülosophy.com/support to check it out. This week's feedback is brought to you by the clever folks from North America's leading hop supplier, Haas, who developed Incognito, a 100% all-natural hop product crafted to deliver highly concentrated flavor while maximizing brewing efficiency and reducing process loss. You wanted more varieties, and the Haas team heard you. Incognito is now available in 8 of the most popular Whirlpool hop varieties. Currently, Centennial, Chinook, Citra, Equinox, Eldorado, HBC 472, Mosaic, and Sabro. All the hoppy goodness you expect without adding any actual hop matter means less process loss, increased profits, and best of all, more beer. You can learn more about Incognito and all the other innovative products Haas has to offer at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, HAAS.com. All right, this week's feedback comes from listener Chris. He says, "Hi, Cade. Having listened to your podcast on Fan, I was wondering if you heard the recent podcast from Beersmith where they discussed some tests on methods to reduce oxygen at beer packaging. The most surprising thing I got from that was the practice of filling a keg with sanitizer and then blowing it out with CO2 results in a huge amount of dissolved oxygen in the beer because it was present in or transferred from the sanitizer water. Now, I'm wondering if it would just be best to sanitize a keg, let it dry completely, and then just purge a few times with CO2. I have a suspicion what you're going to say here, Jordan, but I'm guessing it starts with ferment in kegs.
No, but that's
well, darn.
That's a good point. Minimizing transfers is a good thing. But I actually did listen to this podcast prior to this comment coming in, and I thought it was a great episode as well. And this is something that I was familiar with, and that's why I made the switch a few years ago to SanaClean. SanaClean is a non-foaming sanitizer sold by 5 Star, and this is exactly the fear of the foam that I had, was that I had heard that there was oxygen trapped in the bubbles that the Star San foam creates. So when doing a closed CO2 purge transfer of sanitizer solution in a keg, that's why I think it was actually Scott Janish that recommended using the Star San, and it turned me onto that because of the lack of foam. And so in theory, you should be, if you can get all that sanitizer out, you should have little oxygen in package, at the very least less than you had with a foaming sanitizer. So one trick I've heard of, which I actually haven't done, is people are cutting off the little dip tube on their gas in post on the interior of the keg, and they'll push it all out with CO2 and then turn it upside down, and then it's filled with CO2 now and it's pressurized, and use their thumb to depress the poppet, and the little bit of liquid that remains will then fall out that way. I'm actually using floating dip tubes, so I can't even do that. I take that back. I guess I could do that, but even with a floating dip tube, I inevitably have a little bit of sanitizer solution in there, and I'm not getting overly oxidized beers, but I think that is a wonderful next step. And one thing they actually mention in that episode is suggested using boiling water. And so that's something I want to mess around with, is just pushing out boiling water, because then you've already deaerated it. And if any little bit of water remains, in theory, it's oxygen free and sanitized.
Yeah, exactly. That deaerated water. I mean, that's actually what a lot of breweries do whenever they're doing transfers. A lot of breweries will have deaerating systems, or they'll boil water and create deaerated water tanks. And that's how you do it, right? Take the water up to 210 Fahrenheit or just below 100 C, like 99 C. Take it up to that level, and then boil it, and then push CO2 through the bottom of the tank. And that CO2 will scrub the oxygen out of the water. So then you will have deaerated water, which is really cool. And then you can use that for transfers and fermentation, or pushing things through the line. You can pack your line with deaerated water and then connect that to whatever you're connecting the beer to, then push that deaerated water out, and you get rid of all of the oxygen that's in your transfer lines. So that's a really, really cool option, and definitely something that I think would be fun to explore from a homebrewer's perspective. It'd be pretty easy on fermentation day to raise some water up to 210, and then have that ready to go for those transfers and for sanitizing your keg and all that. And by the way, I wanted to say, I listened to that episode too. It was a great conversation between Brad and Colin, and it makes me want to get both of them here on the Brew Lab to do an episode. And I would highly recommend you check out that episode, because there was not just talk about the transfers and eliminating keg or oxygen during transfer. It was a whole episode about eliminating oxygen in your package, right? In cans, some research that they did where looking at cans and how that was an issue, and bottling from a keg might also trap oxygen in there. That's great. One thing I would say though too, Chris, I have a couple comments based on what you had said. I don't think it's a good idea to just let the keg dry completely and then purge it a few times with CO2, because that's one thing that Colin mentioned there. He's been doing the math, and I trust him to do the math because he wrote the book on water, so I assume he can do math. And I know Colin's a great guy, and he's written a whole bunch of stuff, so I know he can do math. He in that episode, he said it's 92% is all that you're getting out after that purge. So it's 92% CO2 and 8% air. That's a bunch of oxygen that's still left in that purge. Now, if you have access to any sort of DO, dissolved oxygen measuring equipment like Carbox or like people might have at a brewery, you can actually continue to purge until your dissolved oxygen level gets down to a certain point. One other thing I'll say too is CO2 itself has oxygen in it, right? It's not perfect unless you're getting ultra pure quality and paying for that from a supplier, which I don't think anybody is doing that. So CO2 is going to have some level of oxygen, and I've seen CO2 tanks come in that have anywhere from 8 to 20 ppb of oxygen. That's a lot, and that's just your gas. So even if you purged entirely with all of your gas, you might still have up to 20 ppb of oxygen, which could result in staling flavors and all that other stuff. So what I would say, again, this is kind of the high level takeaway. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, okay? We're trying to do the best that we can to minimize oxygen. I still think pushing out, with sanitizer is a good option. Try Jordan's suggestion of using SaniClean for the no foaming. And if you don't want to push out with a sanitizer, try it with deaerated water, or again, try it just purging the keg. I would purge more than 3 times. I would purge a lot of times and at sort of a low level. I wouldn't purge at like 30 PSI. I'd just purge at 10 or 15 PSI, let it fill up, purge, 10 or 15 PSI, let it fill up, purge, and do that 5 or 6 times. That's going to waste a lot of CO2. But those are sort of my recommendations. Anyway, super cool feedback. Jordan and I spent 6 minutes talking about it, so that's awesome. All right, well, we're going to take a short break, and then after that, we'll be talking about bitterness and the boil.
One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Hitting your target bitterness can be difficult. There are a lot of considerations like when to add hops, how much to add, estimating the conversion of alpha acids to iso-alpha acids, quality of bitterness, and now based on last week's episode, we start to understand that proteins can actually play a role in achieving that perfect bitterness. How crazy is that?
We learn so much every day when it comes to this beverage that we've been making for eons. You know, looking back to my first brews, my very first beer was an IPA, and I never brewed with a kit. My very first brew was a partial mash, extract and steeping grains, and I made a few IPAs in the early days because, it was 2010, and of course we wanted to make an IPA. And looking back, that's one thing that really strikes me all these years later is how overly bitter they were, and just the rest, either be it the recipes at the time or my understanding or lack thereof of how to make a beer, it was just really easy to make a beer that was overly bitter. And it's taken a long time to learn my lesson and really dial it back and dial it in.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that commercial in the early 90s that Budweiser or it was one of the macros put out. It's called Bitter Beer Face, right? And it was like, oh, you drink this beer and it's super bitter. I mean, they're essentially making fun of craft, saying that all the craft beers are super bitter, which I wasn't drinking beer in the 90s, so I don't know if beer in the 90s was actually bitter, but I imagine it was. And like you said, Jordan, I certainly remember, 10 or 15 years ago that when we were trying to hit 100 IBUs, right? Like that was the goal. I want to get 100 IBUs in my beer. Shit. I want to get 100 IBUs in my beer, and then I'll increase the alcohol content, and I'll have this bitter and like high alcohol beer, and it'll be great and refreshing. And I just remember, I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I like lagers so much, is because the bitter beers just totally turned me off and they just weren't drinkable. But I'm glad that we've moved away from those. And I do think, I'll say this on air, I do think we moved too far with the hazies, right? It's not bitter enough. I need more bitterness. So I am very glad that we're moving back to that sort of like you said it great, right? West Coast that's being influenced by the East Coast.
Yeah, I think that we're hitting our stride as an industry and making some of the best beers that the world has ever seen. And I think dialing in bitterness has been a big part of that. So maybe we can spend some time in this segment talking about where bitterness comes from.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. And we did talk about that a little bit with Maria, but I wanted to go back over that just in case anybody's listening to this for the first time and hasn't learned that. I mean, of course, one of the most bitter compounds that's in beer are isomerized alpha acids. Those are directly related to bitterness. It's been measured for, 50 years or so, maybe 60 years at this point, 70 years. I really don't know. I'd have to do the math. It's one of the most studied characteristics of beer is bitterness. And conversion of alpha acids to iso-alpha acids is a big deal. It happens with heat. I talked about this with John Paul May on the episode where he was talking about where he discovered a new homologue of alpha acids. Essentially what happens is there's different types of alpha acids. There's cohumulone, adhumulone, colupulone and cohumulone. Well, colupulone. Those are beta acids, but cohumulone and adhumulone, that humulone is what the alpha acid is. Co and ad are just different structural components. And all that means is some are more bitter, some have different bitterness characteristics, and such. But the alpha acids turn into isomerized alpha acids, which makes them soluble in beer. That's the big takeaway. I don't want to get too lost in the science. Alpha acids, not soluble. Iso-alpha acids, soluble and bitter.
So I have a question for you. You said alpha acids are isomerized via heat. Is that true universally, or does it need to be in a specific solution or substrate for that to work? Specifically, would boiling hops in water isomerize the alpha acids?
Yeah, and my understanding for that is yes to some extent, but also not as strongly as it would in beer, right? There are substrates that are in beer that help it isomerize. I'm not super familiar with that hop chemistry. But what I do know is heat is what catalyzes the reaction. If you, for example, if you dry hop beers and put the hops directly into a beer that's sitting at room temperature, you're going to pick up a little bitterness, but that bitterness is not going to come from isomerized alpha acids, right? There are other compounds, which we refer to as ABCs, auxiliary bittering compounds, that would contribute some of that bitterness. Now, this is a key distinction here too. Isoalpha acids are the most bitter compound. That doesn't mean it's the only bitter compound. And I think a lot of people sort of forget that. Like, oh, alpha acids is the only thing that matters. And then I convert alpha acids to isoalpha acids during the boil, and boom, I have my bitterness. Whoa, it's way more complicated than that. And I wish it was that simple, but there's a whole bunch of things that happen. One is not all of the alpha acids actually isomerize during the boil, right? It takes time because it's heat activated. It takes time. The other thing is it's normally less than 30 to 40% of the alpha acids that actually turn into isoalpha acids that get sent into your beer. That's something that we called utilization, and Jordan and I have talked about that on previous episodes. But those are really important things. So that means that we can look at a package of hops and it says, okay, 5%, 6%, 9%, 13% alpha acids, okay? We can put that into our calculator and our brewing software, and that is not necessarily the iso alpha acid that you're going to get out of the beer. That's not necessarily a direct translation of how bitter the beer is going to taste. So this was kind of one of the key findings that spurred Maria's research, which is what's happening. Why aren't alpha acids just transferring over into isoalpha acids? And it turns out this protein interaction plays a big role, which is pretty new research. It's kind of like, oh, we weren't looking at it from this perspective. We've done a whole bunch of research that looks at the isomerization and how it happens and temperature and all that sort of stuff, timing, which we're going to get into and we're going to talk about. But no one had ever looked at it from this protein perspective. So to see if there were even interactions between isoalpha acids and proteins. And it turns out there are, which I was like, oh, that's really cool. Like, okay, here we go. We've discovered, again, something new, a new way to look at bitterness during the boil.
And it kind of harkens back to my question I asked a second ago, is that whether alpha acids can be isomerized in water. And I'm not a chemist, but my guess is that water is fairly low in protein. And that's a pretty big difference that wort has on water.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And, that's a good question. I there's something jogging my memory that says that isomerization will happen, but it won't happen again to the extent that it does in beer. But one of the challenges that we have as a brewer is we are given this information from the hop supplier about the alpha acids concentration that's in hops. And then what do you do with it? Right? So how do you figure out how much bitterness you can expect from those alpha acids? That's a challenge. You have a whole bunch of questions that you need to answer. One is which hops should I even use, right? What is the alpha acid concentration of those hops? How do I know, based on alpha acid concentration, how bitter the beer is going to taste? Because that's what's important, right? Is how the beer is going to taste. How do I calculate that? How do I get there? When do I add the hops? How much do I add? All of these different things are considerations about bitterness. So I think that's what we should talk about on today's episode. Jordan, what do you think?
That sounds like a plan. And, it makes me feel really lucky to be a home brewer in 2023 going on 2024. I guess that might be when this airs, actually. We have this powerful software that's free on the internet. Even 20 years ago, homebrewers didn't have the access to this type of free computational assistance, let alone 100 years ago. And so it makes me wonder what those homebrews in the 1970s tasted like when the instructions were like, add hops.
Right. And it's really interesting too, because, I heard Ken Grossman speak about a year ago. And one of the things that he talked about was back in the 70s, 80s and 90s, whenever he was starting to learn how to brew, there were books, but most of them were in German. First of all, that was a problem. And then, there were books, but it said like, okay, alpha acids convert to isoalpha acids, but then, okay, I have 6% alpha acids. How do I know what it's going to convert? And then the book would basically say, here's all these factors. So you just had to brew the damn beer and see what happened, right? You had to brew the beer and then taste it. And for a long time, there wasn't even a measurement to tell you what the IBU was. I mean, that didn't come around until like the late 70s to actually show like, okay, here's the IBU. This is the International Bittering Unit, right? Here we have this unit, and it'll tell us, how much bitterness the beer has. And now we even know that unit itself is totally flawed too. There's very little correlation. No, I'll take that back. There's a high correlation at low levels between IBU and bitterness and sensory bitterness. But as you get more and more IBUs, that correlation between what you perceive and what is measured is very, very different. You might have a 100 IBU beer that is the most bitter beer that you've ever tasted, and a 100 IBU beer that doesn't taste all that bitter, right? It just happens.
Well, maybe we can unpack that for a second. And I don't know if this has really been discussed on this podcast before, but what is a measured IBU? Right? As I understand it, it's like they're using a device to shoot light through the liquid, and they're counting how many particles it touches or something like that. Maybe you can break that down for us. But to me, it seems like a pretty flawed measurement in terms of true bitterness on your tongue, because there could be other particles in the way. What do you think?
Yeah, that's totally right. So the way that you calculate IBU is you shoot shoot a wavelength of light through using a spectrophotometer through beer, and I forget the exact wavelength. I'll look it up here in a minute and update that or send it in a feedback in a future episode. But there's a specific wavelength of light that hits the bittering particles. Let's say, right, particularly iso alpha acid. It hits those, and then you record the amount of light that passes through the solution. That's considered the absorbance. All right. So the absorbance that is measured, that number times 50, which is a ironically round number, right? for like science, right? Like 50. Dang, we hit it. We nailed it, right? Diving into the weeds a little bit there, it's like y times 50. And I will tell you that 50 is not a universal number in the brewing industry. That's the method. The method says multiply times 50. But a lot of breweries out there are using 46, 48, 52, depending on what their system is and different metrics. And that's all just because, again, the world is way more complicated than like multiply this absorbance times 50, right? But that's what the IBU is. It's the amount of light that passes through a beer solution at a specific wavelength. And that tells you what the IBU is. It was intended to be easily measurable. And again, at low levels, the IBU is highly correlated. So when I'm talking about like a 9, 12, 20 IBU lager, right? Even like a 40 IBU Pilsner, right? Those things are generally correlated to perception of bitterness. But when you get into, 40 IBU, pale ale, that's very different. And the bitterness is perceived very differently in that. Or like a 50 IBU pale ale, that's very different. Or something that's like, 60 IBU IPA versus a 60 IBU Pilsner. Those are going to be a 60 IBU Pilsner is going to be insanely bitter, and nobody's going to want to drink that, right? But a 60 IBU Pale Ale or an IPA is going to taste nice. It's going to taste balanced. It's not going to taste intensely bitter. So you have all these considerations, but sort of unpacking and going back to the IBU again. Why the hell are multiplying times 50? It's because somebody in the 1970s looked and found the absorbance wavelength that reacted with bittering components and created a metric, a scale on which we can consider IBU, right? So the idea was IBU is just intended to be a scale. We can have some idea that if we put this amount of hop alpha acids in the boil, if we have this amount of IBU in the measured beer, we can have a scale for reference. So it's like, okay, if I drink my beer and at 30 IBUs, my beer tastes great, that's awesome. If I drink my beer and at 40 IBUs, it's too bitter, that means I need to go down, right? That means when I'm brewing a new recipe or I'm changing an ingredient or something like that, I have a reference that I can know. And this is just a metric for brewers, right? It's just a metric to like understand how my beer relates to itself. But you get into all these crazy weeds. We've started now using whirlpool hops. We've started dry hopping. We've started adding huge amounts of hops in both of those. We've started changing up timing additions. We're no longer brewing just Pilsners, right? We're brewing a whole bunch of other beers. all of these things play a role in that perception of bitterness. So the IBU itself has kind of become a silly metric outside of traditional lagers, right? A traditional light lager brewing. The IBU doesn't really make sense for IPAs or anything else, although it is kind of still a frame of reference. It's correlated, but loosely correlated, if that makes sense.
Right. And so what you've just described is the laboratory measurement. What about calculation estimates? And I'm curious, what's the order of operations there? Did like in terms of Rager or Tinseth or whatever, did those come well after the laboratory measurements? Is this a fairly recent phenomenon, the ability to calculate them?
Yes. Yeah. Well, the ability to calculate IBU was from like the 70s, right? So that ability has been able to calculate for a long time. But Rager and Tinseth and all these other formulas that we talk about, or at least that are the traditional formulas, is a bunch of guys that just brewed a whole bunch of beers, right? And then they set up and they put the measured IBU. Right. So they added hops to the boil at different times, and then they measured the IBU using that method. Right. And then it spits out a number for the IBU. They do that 100 times or 200 times. And then they have a data set, and that data set allows them to say, okay, when I put 1 gram of a 6 let's say 1 ounce, 28 grams of a 6 alpha acid hop at 60 minutes, I'm going to get 35 IBUs. Right. And so that means that's what I'm going to get in measured IBU. So then Tinseth, all it's doing, or Rager and those other formulas, are using a different, let's say a different equation to say, okay, I've put in 1 ounce of hops, 28 grams at 60 minutes at 6 alpha acid, and that will result in 35 IBUs, right? It spits out that number. And that's based on the experiments that they did. There's nothing wrong with that approach. I'm going to say that very, very, very clearly, right? But you're limited by the size of your data set. So if they had been able to do it 1,000,000 times, their method would probably be very accurate, right? And if also they were able to consider things like dry hopping and whirlpool and all those other considerations, their method would be much more accurate than it is today, right? But they weren't. They were just, people brewing, right? And to do that, you have to brew 100 beers, and brewing 100 beers takes a long time, and that's a lot of effort, and measuring 100 beers takes a long time, right? So you can get a decent sized data set from those, but it means that they're inherently flawed. And so I want to spend some time in the next segment after the break talking about this new method, which Jordan, you pointed me to, which I think is fantastic. It's the SMPH method that was by John Paul Hosom. And I did an episode on this, and I would highly encourage people to look at that method. We'll talk about it again after the break. But he brewed 700 beers and then essentially did the same thing. But he's taking into account all sorts of different things, like the research that has suggested that iso-alpha acids are the most bitter, but beta acids and alpha acids are still 60% as bitter. And there are other auxiliary bittering compounds, timing, whirlpool, dry hop, all that other stuff. But we've been talking about these things, right? I've just mentioned timing, whirlpool, amount of hops, alpha acids, all that stuff. That's still, let's take it back up to the high level for a second. When you, Jordan, are trying to calculate the bitterness for your beer, what things are you looking at, and what are you doing to figure out what bitterness you're going to hit?
Well, luckily we have software like Brewfather, and you can just input that in. So these things are a function of, wort volume, the time that you're boiling it. One thing I'm not accounting for really is whether it's a pellet or a whole leaf. I believe that Tinseth was like a home brewer, and he was using whole cones at the time. And so there's probably some differences there related to using pellets. But what I'm looking at is I look at the bag of hops. I use Yakima Valley hops, and I look at the crop year. And this is, if Brewfather, if you're listening, that's the one thing I want in your software, is I do not believe that they have a way to adjust for hop age. So I actually open up my copy of Beersmith, and I use Beersmith to adjust for the predicted alpha acid loss associated with the assumed age of the hops. So if it says crop year 2022, I just kind of assume maybe they're harvested in like September and kind of fudge it a little bit there. Or if it's New Zealand hops, what are those, like March or something like that? So I will adjust the assumed alpha acid based on what's printed on the package and the predicted crop or harvest date. And then I will put that into my software, and then obviously I'm putting in the times, and it's reflecting how the size of the batch I'm making, and that really helps me dial it in. I think the other things that I'm thinking about here are cohumulone content. I've spoken about before. I try to gravitate towards low cohumulone hops. In theory, I'm getting a smoother bitterness from that. The other thing is that there's some stylistic choices there too. I'm a fan of using authentic ingredients. So for a lager, European hops have been very low alpha lately. But I want to use European hops. So that means I'm using a ton of low alpha European nobles in my European lagers. Whereas a, IPA, why not just use Magnum? There's no reason to, harken back to authenticity in terms of a European origin. And so I'm looking for alpha at that point. So there's a lot of different factors, and kind of really runs through my entire brewing ethos, is like every style deserves its own considerations.
Yeah. So back up to that question then real quick. Like you said that you're doing, like European varieties, right? For Pilsners and stuff. How do you choose? How do you decide? Like, how do you know, like, okay, in this one, I'm going to do a low alpha hop because it's European, or in this one, I'm going to do a high alpha hop. And like, how do you decide that? And what do you do with those old hops, which is one thing that you mentioned as well too. Like, how do you make these choices? Like in this one, I'm going to use Zotz. Like, what if you're looking in your refrigerator and you're brewing a Pilsner this week and you're like, crap, I'm out of Zotz, but I've got Magnum.
Well, if it was to come down to that and I had Magnum, I would not be opposed to using Magnum. But I would honestly probably defer to the brew day and make an IPA instead or something like that. Mm-hmm. I try not, at least when it comes to hops, I'm not like really big into sacrificing, yeast. Like, I've been brewing ales with lager yeast lately, or malt. I'll make an IPA with Barca Pilsner if that's what I have on hand. There's probably some cost implications there, but with hops, I'm a little more dogmatic in terms of matching the hop to the style in which it allegedly represents. So when it comes to like making a German Pilsner, I'm not going to be using Magnum and Strata if that's what I have on hand. I would make a West Coast Pilsner instead, right? And so kind of leaning into that. But I will say, when it comes to nobles, I've found that really whatever you have on hand works great. So if I was to make, the exception being Czech beer, if I'm going to make a Czech beer, I want to use Czech hops. I think that does matter. So Satz is my preferred, but obviously there's a few other varieties out there, and I'd like to explore some of the other ones. But when it comes to German beers, if I have Tettnanger and I have Hallertau and I have Saphir, whatever, maybe use all three, maybe use one. And if I go to brew a lager that day, like a German Helles, and only one of those three exists, it's going to be great. And so I think that there's a lot of leeway when it comes to German nobles, when it comes to German beer production. Obviously, Tettnanger, in theory, should taste different than Saphir, but I think they both make great beers, and I think that that's the fun of homebrewing, is the batch you made tomorrow might taste different from the batch you made 3 months ago, and that's part of the fun.
Mm-hmm. And so I have a question then about that too. So if you're using low alpha acid hops, does efficiency matter for you? If you're having to use 2 or 3 times the amount of hops to achieve your, target IBU or whatever you're targeting to, does the efficiency matter? Are you worried about that beer loss or any additional vegetal character or anything like that?
Dude, I'm dry hopping 5 gallons of IPA with like 10 ounces of hops.
I know. I just still don't understand why you're doing that, but you do. No, but I mean, I agree with you that I think there is something to be said about traditional ingredients and traditional styles, right? If you're trying to make a traditional German Pils and you're not using a continental Pilsner or like Barca, for example, and you're not using a German hop and you're not using a German yeast, it's probably not going to taste like a German Pils. I think you can make some approximations, but again, if you're trying to go for German Pils, brew with German ingredients, right? If you're trying to go with Czech Pils, brew with Czech ingredients, and that kind of makes sense to me. And so that's one of the considerations that I often have. That said, for bittering hops, I usually don't care, right? Like for really bittering hops, I'll use Magnum on a German Pilsner, or whatever. I'm just kind of like, it's just adding bitterness. So I for a long time I was like, I'm just going to use whatever. I have one bittering hop, and it's Magnum, and right now that's what it is. It's always something, but Magnum is what it is right now. It might be CTZ or whatever for other people, but I have one bittering hop, and that bittering hop is in all of my beers. But as I learn more and more about this, I'm starting to wonder if there is something to this. No, low alpha acid hops are adding other flavor components during the boil, right? That aren't just the alpha acids. Like this whole concept that the bitterness is the only thing that Magnum adds, I think is flawed, right? And same thing with Zatz or any of the Tettnang or Noble varieties that are low alpha, that even at 3 or 4%, alpha, they're still adding something to the beer.
Right. And I think that if you had a German Magnum versus an American Magnum using that at 60 minutes, you probably would struggle to tell the difference between the two. But I think there's two major things going on here. One, like you mentioned, is pure, volume of vegetal matter. If you're using a 15% alpha American Magnum versus a 2% German Hallertauer, you have way more hop matter going into your kettle to achieve the same number of IBUs. And so surely at a certain point, that's going to make a flavor difference. Now, if you're trying to get 2 IBUs from either, maybe not. But if you're trying to get 20, 40 IBUs from that 60-minute addition, the sheer amount of vegetal matter in solution, I would think would make a difference. But in addition to that, one, arguably, there is a flavor associated with Hallertau that does carry through, that is different than Magnum, which is notoriously clean. But secondly, there's maybe something related to this alpha to beta acid ratio, where you have a much more 1-to-1 ratio with low alpha European varieties than you do with a Magnum, which is going to be more like 15 or 5-to-1 or something like that. I don't know what the number would be, but the ratio is going to be way more stark, and you're going to have way more alpha acid relative to beta acid. And so German brewers and German, beer purists argue that there's some magic in these low alpha hops that you just can't replicate with a higher alpha variety. So if you're wanting to make the most authentic replica, using the low alpha hops is one little trick, despite the fact that you're going to have more beer loss and spend more on hops because of the inefficiencies associated with it.
Yeah, I mean, and that makes a lot of sense to me too. Again, as we learn more and more about hops, I think that you're right on there, right? That maybe the alpha and beta ratio has a relationship to it. Maybe there are other things like cohumulone content that change things, and of course, hop schedule changes it as well. So we've been dancing around that, but we do need to take a quick break, and I want to start there whenever we come back from the break, talking about how we decide on what hops go at 60 minutes, what goes at 30, 10, 5, so and so. But before we do that, I want to clean up the IBU measurement real quick. So I looked it up while we were talking, and it's absorbance at 275 nanometers. So that's the specific wavelength. And I forgot, there's one other thing that's really important. Having done this assay a bunch of times, I can't believe I forgot it, because I really hate doing this assay because it's miserable to actually do in real life. You take the beer and you make an isooctane extraction. So isooctane is pure gas, right? Like the octane in your car is like what, 87 or 92 or 96, whatever the different gasoline ratios are. Isooctane is 100%, so it's 100. And you take this and you add a little bit of acid to the beer, and then you shake it up for a really long time. It creates an emulsion, all right, where there's beer at the bottom and then there's this isooctane that sits on the top. And essentially what happens is the isooctane pulls out all of those bitter acids, but that emulsion is never perfect. And no matter what I do, I can never get a pure emulsion. So the absorbance is going to be dependent on how clear the everything is. So isooctane is very clear. It's a transparent liquid. It's totally clear. And that's, but if you have any of that emulsion, it looks like oil and vinegar, right? If you have oil and vinegar, they separate, and then, oil is on the top and vinegar is on the bottom. But if you add garlic or something in it, it creates an emulsion and it becomes hazy, right? If you get any of that emulsion in your assay, it messes up the whole assay, and then you can't trust your bitterness readings. So that's the assay itself. So again, we've got this assay which is decent, right? It's better than nothing, right? We've got this assay where we're measuring the absorbance of beer of light going through this beer. We're multiplying it by 50 because okay, we've decided 50 is the number we're going to multiply it by. And then we've got the added concern of the assay itself being pretty difficult to perform and not very replicable between reps. So this whole concept of the IBU just sticks in my craw a little bit. That it's one of those metrics that I wish we could get away from, and I wish we could find something different. But I don't know if that's going to happen. The IBU, again, still does correlate at low levels very strongly and at high levels somewhat. But I just wanted to leave that there before we take a break. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about timing additions, first wort hops, 60 minutes, 30-10, etc., and also Whirlpool survivables and dry hopping.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
Bitterness is important, but it's not everything. Aroma and flavor from hops is also important, and to that end, brewers have started using the Whirlpool dry hopping to increase aroma and flavor, but we also make different timing additions, right? Hops that are added at 60 minutes taste different than hops that are added at 5 minutes. Only recently have we started to realize that bitterness comes throughout the boil, not just at that 60-minute addition or 30-minute or 20-minute addition. It comes at 5, 10, the Whirlpool. And so, Jordan, how do we decide when we're going to add hops?
For me, I have a target in mind, right? And so I tend to brew kind of classic styles. So, be it a West Coast IPA or a Saison or something like that. I look at the style guidelines and look at the range of acceptable IBUs. Generally speaking, with styles, I kind of like to shoot in the middle. I don't want it to be too strong, too weak, too bitter, too sweet, you name it. And so I'll think about my end goal and then start to adjust my additions accordingly. Because it's really easy if you have a beer that doesn't need any finishing hops. Like I made a cream ale a few weeks ago, and I just had one addition at 60 minutes, done. But when you're making something like an IPA and you're going to be doing those flame out additions, et cetera, you got to mind your IBUs because there's a temptation, at least that I have, to add as many Whirlpool hops as possible. But you got to recognize that those are adding some level of bitterness. So you need to think about this as like a puzzle, right? And that you have to get all the pieces to fit together without it, just getting out of hand, because it is definitely possible to have an IPA that's too bitter. And so you got to really be paying attention to kind of the whole equation to make sure you're hitting your target.
So when you say you're hitting the end goal, are you talking about like you're hitting a target IBU, like a specific like target IBU from whatever the formula is that you're using in your software? Or are you hitting a target aroma and flavor? Or are you hitting like a target amount? Like, for example, are you trying to put 7 ounces of Whirlpool hops in there, or, 10 ounces of Whirlpool hops in there? Like, what are you talking about whenever you mean hit that end goal?
Right. And so what you're exposing is really more of a 4-dimensional space that we're dealing with here, right? Because certain certain styles, it really is just IBU, right? And for me, there's not a ton that are like that, because even a lager, I think that a 5-minute addition or something like that adds a nice little bit of aroma character. So I'm typically not just making single edition beers for anything I do. In fact, that cream ale I mentioned was a bit of a exception to that rule, because I accidentally ran out of hops. And so I was like, just the 60-minute edition is going to be fine. So when it again, everything is stylistically dependent, right? And so I'm not using, 1 ounce or 2 ounces per gallon of hops in the Whirlpool in a Saison, or unless I'm making a hoppy saison, right?
Yeah.
So generally speaking, you got to think about what's appropriate for the style first. And so I think the BJCP guidelines and just experience are a really good way to go about that. And really understand, does this beer, every beer needs some level of bitterness, right? But not every beer needs an intense tropical bouquet of hop aroma. And so you got to think about, what does the style demand, or what do you want? For example, like I just said, hoppy saison rocks. And you can kind of, do basically a West Coast IPA or maybe even a New England IPA approach and just pitch saison yeast, and it could be pretty good. And so obviously there's some nuances there to dial that in to make it really work. But I think having an understanding of what you're going for is important there. And that's going to really start to lead you down the various paths in terms of the questions that you just asked.
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, then I think your system is kind of a lot of the way that my system is. It's kind of like, what am I going for in that particular beer? What's the most important part of that beer for hops, right? And then kind of working backwards from there, right? If I'm making an IPA, like let's just say I'm making a traditional West Coast IPA, I know that bitterness is going to be important, but I also know that hop aroma and flavor are going to be important. So I know that I'm going to be adding some sort of hops either at flame out or in the whirlpool, and I'm going to be adding a dry hop. And I know those things are going to add bitterness. So I'm probably starting there to some extent, right? And I know based on the style guideline, some estimation of where the IBUs, quote, should be. And I'm going to put that in again, big air quotes, right? Because let's say for an IPA, I want to hit 60 IBUs, right? At like 6.5% alcohol or something. So if I want to hit that number, then I start saying, okay, well, I know I want to add 3 or 4 or 5 ounces of dry hops. So I'm going to do that. I'm not adding 10 ounces of dry hops in an IPA, but adding 3, 4, 5 ounces in a 5-gallon batch, something like 125 grams. In a 20 liter batch for metric conversions, but something like that. And then I'll say, okay, that adds some amount of bitterness, we know. And so most of the software now will adjust for some amount of bitterness, at least in the whirlpool. I'm not sure exactly about dry hopping. I don't think Brewfather adjusts for bitterness for dry hopping. So then I'll take that information and I'll usually add in my head like 5 IBU for a dry hop addition at that level, right? And that's a pretty high dry hop addition, something like 100 125 grams in a 20 liter batch, or 3 or 4 ounces, 5 ounces in a 5-gallon batch. That's a hefty dry hop addition. It's not crazy, it's not anything nuts, but it's a hefty dry hop addition. So I'll add like 5 IBUs. So I'll start looking at the whirlpool next, right? And the whirlpool, if I'm usually adding like 3 ounces, maybe 4 ounces in the whirlpool, something like that. That's what 75 to 100 ounce or 100 grams in the whirlpool, and I know that's going to give me more bitterness. And now, so most of the brewing software now has adjusted where they're going to calculate some addition of bitterness from that whirlpool addition. And there's a bunch of different ways you can change the software to do that. And maybe that's a question I should have Brad Smith on to talk about, is adjusting brewing software for your system. That might be a good way to talk about it. But there's some level of bitterness that's picked up from the whirlpool. And then I'll go from there and say, okay, now I want to do a 60-30 and 10 edition. So I'll do a 60-minute edition, and usually that's something like 10 grams of Magnum, right? It's a very, very low amount that I'm adding in at that 60-minute. And that's usually going to pick up like 25 to 30 IBUs. And so if I'm trying to hit 60, I might already be at 45 or 50, and then I might just add a small charge on, the middle 30 and 5-minute edition or so. So I'm kind of working back from what's important. If I'm going with a Pilsner, I'm probably starting with that bitterness edition. If I'm making especially like a German Pilsner with a low alpha hop, I am going to add a 5-minute edition or a 20-minute edition, but I'm going to start at that 60-minute edition and say, okay, I want to hit like 20 to 30 IBUs on this Pilsner. So I'm going to hit, or maybe not even that much, 20 IBUs on a Pilsner is probably plenty. But if I add a 10 grams of Magnum at 60 minutes, that's going to give me 15 IBUs, right? So I don't need to add a whole lot as I'm going on. So it's kind of like your starting point changes, but it is that end goal. Like, what's important for the style here? And ironically, did you hear me say I'm using IBU to calculate all of this stuff, right? That's because in my mind, having brewed for, I don't know, almost 15 years now, I have adjusted what IBU means to me and where I want to be on particular styles. That's experience that's taught me that. That's not necessarily like a hard number that I need to hit on every IBU, but the experience has taught me this is the IBU I want to hit in this beer. This is the IBU I want to hit in this style. And that took a long time to develop, and it's still not perfect.
Well, I think what you're exposing here is it's a bit of an algebraic equation, right? And that we have an N number that we're targeting, or give or take 5 or 10 IBUs maybe. So an N range. And you, in a world where you have multiple additions, you're trying to balance the various IBUs that they contribute to equal your N range. And then you need to balance the relative importance of a given addition. So something like a New England IPA and a West Coast IPA could have the same estimated IBUs, right? But on the New England IPA, we're getting nearly all of that, if not all of it, from the Whirlpool, right? But so if we had a 60 IBU New England IPA and a 60 IBU West Coast IPA, they're going to taste dramatically different if you have some of those IBUs coming from a 60-minute addition. So not all IBUs are created equal in this algebraic equation that we have in front of us. So it's like really a balancing act of like, do I need aroma? Do I need like true, bitterness? And collectively, with this end goal of X IBUs in mind, how do I divvy up the cards so I get somewhere in that range? And so that's really what I'm doing. And style really helps drive that conversation.
Yeah, and I'll say one more thing too, like the traditional method of brewing too, of that 60-30-10, or 60-35. What is it? You brew that? What, 60-30-10? Is that what you say for your additions in an IPA? You do a 60-minute, a 30-minute, and a 20-minute, or is it a 10-minute? Do you remember?
For again, because I'm only really brewing West Coast IPA, I'm doing a 60-minute addition, and then some sort of mid-boil, non-flame out addition, and then flame out. And I've kind of been messing around with that, be it 20-minute, 10-minute, 5-minute, but definitely doing Whirlpool and definitely doing a 60-minute addition on the West Coast IPA. Whether that's one thing I'd love to do a Brülosophy experiment on. Can you actually taste mid-boil additions in a heavily hopped IPA? I don't know. Maybe the with the bitterness charge and the Whirlpool charge, anything in the middle, can you actually taste it? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. That's what I'm talking about with tradition, right? Because I think it was like 60, 30, and 10 was like the traditional, addition. But I think that may have, again, shifted to Whirlpool as we're trying to get more aroma in West Coast styles, right? So, a 60, 30, and then flame out addition is a very traditional way to brew a pale ale, an American-style pale ale or IPA. That was what was brewed a long time. It's been brewed for a couple of decades now, as like, this is how you make this beer stylistically. So I will say that's one of the ways that I choose what hop additions I'm going to make. Is traditionally when I've brewed pale ales in the past and for years and decades, a lot of the pale ales that I want to emulate are brewed in this way. So I brew it in that way too, right? And like you said, I'm not sure that I would taste much if I just took the bitterness from that mid-boil addition and added it to the 60 and to the Whirlpool. If you could actually brew the beer that tasted the same, that'd be a really fun experiment. But that's kind of how I do that. One of the other things that we've been talking about in this episode too is that we're getting significant pickup from the Whirlpool, right? You're going to get bitterness from the Whirlpool. So brewing West Coast IPAs with a New England influence, how are you deciding and how are you figuring out how to adjust your software for what amounts of hops you're adding and what bitterness contribution that's going to give you when you're adding hops at the Whirlpool?
Right. So I'm using Brewfather these days. And one thing that's cool in that software is they have a setting where you can specify the temperature of the Whirlpool. And so as I understand it, the lower the temperature of your Whirlpool, the less predicted isomerization that will occur, and thus the fewer IBUs that you'll get from the same amount of hops if you use a lower temperature relative to the comparison. So I'm typically just adding hops at flameout, turning the temperature off and then whirlpooling in place, and it just kind of naturally starts to fall at that point. I'm not typically force cooling to like 180, but that is one way in which you can pack more hops physically into the kettle without the a 1-to-1 correlation in terms of the amount of IBUs that you're picking up. And in fact, the last time I did that, I did this ghost town method. They recommend going down to 180, and I threw in an ungodly amount of hops in a 5-gallon batch, like a pound, and the beer came out hazy. And so, even though it's supposed to be a West Coast IPA, and so that is definitely something to think about. There is, when doing a whirlpool, you can get more hops in solution if you lower the temperature, but it might come at the consequence of haze.
Yeah, haze might be an issue there too. But what I hear you say too is that like temperature is important, right? What about timing for whirlpool? Are you measuring? Are you taking a clock, and saying, all right, this is in there for 20 minutes or 10 minutes or any of that?
So when in the brewing software, and I know Beersmith, you can adjust the temperature, and I have an older edition of Beersmith, so I don't know if the newer software allows you to adjust the temperature. But when you adjust the time in both Beersmith and Brewfather, it does adjust the amount of IBUs that are predicted to come out of a whirlpool edition. So a 30-minute whirlpool would get more, I don't know, maybe 3 times as much as a 10-minute whirlpool. I will admit, I will often put 10 minutes because the number in terms of the predicted IBUs is more in line with what I'm going for, even though it might take longer than that. So I use a number in the software, but I don't really pay too much attention as to whether that's happening in reality. So for example, if I put 10 minutes and 10 minutes is hit, I don't then pull the hops out. So I don't really know what's happening, but I don't want the beer to be too bitter, especially a whirlpooled IPA or something like that. So I'm mindful of that, and I'm not whirlpooling for an hour, I'll say that.
Yeah, for sure, right? And one other thing too, I would say is you're taking the alpha acid on the package, right, and putting that in the software for that hop addition, and then it's telling you, it's spitting out that number based on temperature and timing, what bitterness addition that whirlpool is going to pick up. I wanted to say, it just popped into my head, and we should have probably talked about it in the first segment, but we'll talk about it now. You really need to input the alpha acid that's on the package of hops that you're adding into the beer. And timing, or the age of the hops matters, right? Because the alpha acids will degrade over time. It's this whole thing we call the hop storage index. That's a measure of how much the hops degrade over time, right? There's a reason why we have that. Even at cold temperature in your freezer, your alpha acids available for isomerization will decrease. And Brewfather does a hop age calculation now too. So you can put in the age of your hops. I'm pretty sure you can put in the age of your hops, and it'll spit out like what that utilization to. I know that Beersmith does that, and I'm pretty sure that Brewfather does. I'm using Brewfather too. But I'm not using particularly old hops, so I haven't really worried about it. I'm not using, except maybe, I'm really not using anything too old these days. But the importance there is, don't rely on the numbers that are auto-populated by your software, right? Who knows when those numbers were populated, and hops change every single year. Okay, they change every year. So if you got 6.5% last year, there's no reason to think you're going to get 6.5% this year. You might get 6%, you might get 7%, you might get 5.5%, you might get 9%. It totally depends on the hop year. So every time you get a package of hops and you're brewing with that, don't assume that whatever is in the software is going to be the alpha acid concentration of the hops that you're brewing with. It's a big, big deal that I think a lot of brewers just like, it's close enough, it'll be fine. I'm just going to put it in and we'll go from there. No, if you're using an ounce of 7% alpha acid hops, and the recipe calls for an ounce of 4% alpha acid hops, that's a crazy, ridiculous difference, right? And hops may have that level of variability each year. That's just kind of the way that it goes whenever you're using a naturally grown product. So be sure that you're putting that information into your brewing software. And I'll do another plug too. Put all of the information that you can into the software. Put the information about the age of your yeast. Put the information about your malt in there to the extent that you can get that information. Put all that information in your software. That's the best way that you're going to get the most repeatable product whenever it comes out of the software. So we talked about whirlpool. Then what about dry hopping? Are you calculating any additional bitterness from dry hopping? I'm honestly not.
I'm not, and that is one place where I do not adjust the alpha acid because I'm always adjusting alpha acid based on whatever the default in the software. It's never what you actually have, right? But for dry hops, who cares? And so I'm not that worried about it. The other thing is time, right? The software, you definitely want to be paying attention to. You wouldn't put 10 minutes in the software when you actually put 60 minutes in reality, right? That's a huge difference. Yeah. But if the software defaults to 7 days, it's like, it doesn't really matter because the software is not like doing anything based on the number on days in terms of the dry hop. So I'm not adjusting in that regard.
Yeah, I will say the only thing I do is sort of in my head, I kind of think of like 5 to maybe 10 IBUs different. Really, I'd be shocked if I got 10 IBUs from a dry hop, but 5 IBUs maybe. And 5 IBUs is kind of the taste threshold for difference in perception of bitterness, right? Is most people can't taste a difference that's less than 5 IBUs. So if you're adding less than, again, 100 grams of hops or something like that, you're probably not going to get too much of an IBU difference. But that is not the case. Well, it is the case a little bit when you're using some of the oil extracts. So Spectrum and Incognito, they have alphas. Now, generally, Whirlpool's kind of a unique case. Incognito in the Whirlpool is a unique case because it does have alpha acids. But again, you're talking about incredibly low utilization because you're in the Whirlpool. There's not that much isomerization that's happening. And from what I've heard anecdotally, it's like less than 10% utilization. So whatever alpha acids that Incognito is adding, it's less than 10% of that actually getting converted to isoalpha acids. On the flip side, Spectrum is water soluble. So the alpha acids and polyphenols will actually hang around and go into solution. So if you're dry hopping with Spectrum, you might have a little bit of a bitterness pickup. I don't think it's going to be a huge amount still, right? But that's something to think about and something that probably we're going to be doing future, not Oregon State and not me particularly, but it's probably something that people are going to want to look at in the future with these oils is there a bitterness pickup from Incognito or from Spectrum? My guess is if there is, it's going to be minimal and you can still treat them the same way as T90, but there are some things to consider when you're using those hop oils. And one other thing, so I wanted to talk about, I mentioned that we were going to talk about this SMPH method of calculating beer bitterness, and I want to spend like maybe 5 minutes at the end of the show talking about it, because we didn't get to do an applying the science episode on it, but it's a super cool method. And Jordan, you actually keyed me onto this. It was in a BYO article. So again, Patreon members, Brad Ring, you can ask him questions about this article. It was in that magazine. But John Paul Holsom essentially went out and brewed hundreds of beers and then looked at all of these different factors. So he used these factors in isolation. He looked at things like when you add hops during the kettle or during the dry hop, during Whirlpool, and measured the IPUs. Sent it off, measured the IPUs. He looked at pellets versus whole cones. He looked at amount of hops. He looked at the pH of the wort. He looked at clarity. He looked at storage conditions, gravity, Krausen, age of the beer, the boiling point, all these different considerations. And he created a website. You can just Google SMPH model for calculating bitterness. And he created a website where you can put in all of the information from your brewing practices, the alpha acids of the hops, and it's going to spit out a number that is highly correlated to the IBU. This is important because if you use Rager or you use Tensith or sort of the standard hop calculations from brewing software, those are going to be wrong if you're doing things like Whirlpool editions, a dry hop, have different wort pHs, all that sort of stuff, using pellets and whole cones, all that sort of stuff. All that stuff is actually going to matter. And it's going to mean that what the calculated IBU using those formulas is not going to be the measured IBU that comes out in the beer. Set aside the whole sensory impact for a second, but if at least we can use IBU as a yardstick, right? If we can use it as a measurement of relative differences between beers, using the SMPH model, you can actually use the IBU as a difference between Pilsner and IPA. So it's less dependent on beer style than using those other formulas, which I think is the power of that method. And it's really, really, really cool method. And Jordan, I know that you pointed me onto that. It's not available, I don't think, in Brewfather or in Beersmith or any of those places. You have to find it on the internet, and it is a comprehensive model. So you are going to be putting in things like Are you using pellets or whole cones? What's your hopping rate? What's your wort pH? What's your intended gravity? Are you krausening? Are you, how fast are you cooling your wort? All of these little pieces of information are going to go into that formula, but it's going to give you an accurate and repeatable IBU number, which I think is interesting. And one last thing on this model, or at least, I'll let you comment on it too, Jordan, because it's a pretty cool model. But he breaks down what factors are important to IBU or to bitterness considerations and what factors aren't. So naturally, when you add the hops is probably the most important high impact factor. So are you adding a 60-minute, 30-minute, 20-minute, 5-minute, whirlpool, dry hop, whatever? Probably the most important. Pellets and whole cones contribute different bitterness. So if you're brewing with pellets and brewing with whole cones, there's different bitterness that's going to be associated with those. The amount of hops you add also plays a role. The pH of your wort during the boil matters. That's going to contribute to the differences in bitterness. In fact, and this one is highly interesting. I think this is so interesting based on what Maria and I talked about last week. Wort clarity plays a role. Well, clarity is a protein polyphenol complex. So if there's proteins that are binding to those hops, that's going to change, binding to those isoalpha acids based on Maria's research, that's going to change the bitterness of the beer. These are what he calls his high impact factors. Those are the things that play a big role in determining bitterness. Then still playing a role, but not as much, is how well were your hops stored? What's the actual deterioration of alpha acids from what was on the package? What's the gravity of your wort? Because the sugar concentration of your wort is actually going to change the amount of isomerization. Are you krausening? How old is the beer, right? Has the beer been sitting for a long time? If so, alpha acids are going to degrade over time. That's also a factor that happens. But things that don't matter, or at least matter less than this is also something that's cool. Flocculation of yeast, filtering, finings, the rate that you cool the wort, right? Hot break, cold break doesn't seem to matter as much in terms of the bitterness. That one especially is interesting to me. Hot break versus cold break. I wonder what proteins are staying in the beer with unclear wort, with wort clarity, and then what proteins are actually falling out during hot break and cold break. So based on Maria's research, I wonder if there's some issue about we might need to start thinking about the composition of proteins and not just the amount of protein that's present, but which specific proteins are coming from the malts and coming from the boil and all that, and which is in there. But anyway, that was a long-winded 5-minute summary of that SMPH method, but I think that's a really cool way to start thinking about IBUs, and it gives us the ability to look at IBUs across different styles. That IBU finally becomes an actual yardstick that you can look at and say, okay, I can anticipate that this is the bitterness that I'm going to get from this. At least whenever I do these things, the measured IBU is actually going to match up, because it doesn't necessarily do that with Tensith and Rager. Again, their data set wasn't 1 million data points. It was 100 or 200. And so, again, there's nothing wrong with their approach. It's better than nothing. It's just not as powerful as this model.
Right. This really exposes how complicated it truly is. And that the fact that these formulas that we're using are really, simple, but 2, don't take into account a lot of things, and ultimately are reflective of the IBUs of the wort, going into the fermenter. They're not taking into account beer age, et cetera. And so what we've learned is that the beer IBU on your tongue is going to be different than the beer IBU or the wort IBU, at yeast pitch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Exactly. The IBU on your tongue and the wort is going to be different than the IBU yeast pitch, and the IBU is actually going to change. Right? If you measure it from the wort and then measure it at the end of fermentation, the IBU is actually going to change. Measure it in the bottle after it's been there for 6 months, the IBU is going to change, right? But at least the SMPH method gives you an idea of what the IBU would actually measure at. And then if you have that yardstick and you can hit that yardstick consistently, then you, through your own brewer's experience, can determine what's important, what IBU number I need to hit for my beer so that it's the best during the time period that I'm going to drink it. It's a complicated issue, but hey, this is what we love about brewing, right? There's all these little dials that you can choose, and you can brew a different beer every single day if you want to, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you just had to hit a button and the world's best IPA came out, it wouldn't be fun. That's what stores are for.
Exactly. Right? Totally. And I mean, of course, like brewers are doing different things all over the world and all over the country. Even within the same styles, there's still a lot of range from brewery to brewery. Again, I'm a big proponent. I think there's this brewer's thumbprint piece of it, and I think this could be a part of it, is the bitterness of the beer and how you add hops and when you add hops, of course, your system and all those other little fun things that we get to talk about in this podcast. So it's a lot of fun. Well, Jordan, we talked a lot about beer bitterness and hitting your target bitterness. I hope we gave some good tips and tricks. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
There's so much to talk about. We could do 2 more episodes about this. One thing I didn't mention is something I've been doing lately is for West Coast IPAs, a trick I actually learned from Ghost Town is shoot for 10 IBUs above your OG. So if you're making a 1060 beer, you want a 1060 beer would be 70 IBUs target. So that's my latest trick for West Coast IPA is plus 10 for the IBUs.
Plus 10 for your gravity. I mean, again, work gravity is a factor that John Paul Hosum found as part of SMPH. So it makes sense to me. Well, like you said, Jordan, I think we could do 2 or 3 more episodes on this, and I'm sure there will be more science to look at on this topic in the future. But in any event, Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode on our next topic. See y'all then.
The Brew Lab is a production of Brülosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit Brülosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brülosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.